Before we start our episode today, this is just a reminder. History Hack does have a Patreon account and all of your donations are gratefully appreciated. There's lots of perks on there, secret groups on Facebook. Do get involved. We would love to see more of you. Enjoy the episode today. Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. We are firmly rooted in the 20th century today, aren't we, Beth? But not a part of the 20th century that we usually do.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that we're not familiar with at all, but hopefully really looking forward to this one. Should be very interesting. So our guest today is Dr. David Brydon, who's a lecturer in the history of modern international relations at King's College London. His main interests include modern Spanish history, the Cold War, and the history of global health. Books that you could be keeping an eye out for include Franco's Internationalists and Internationalists in European History. But he's here today to talk to us about the global nature of the Cold War. So welcome, David. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Wonderful. So let's just start basically with the traditional view of the Cold War. How do we generally tend to think about what of it, its origins, and the way in which it unfolds?
So I think we learn about the Cold War, right, in school, partly, but also we understand the Cold War through things like films and TV programs and things like that. And if you grew up in Britain, I think the way that the Cold War was taught in schools and the way it was kind of presented in these films and TV programs was of a kind of a bipolar conflict. So a conflict that was primarily about the United States and the Soviet Union. And if you studied it at school, you probably studied kind of certain key moments of that conflict. So you might have talked about the origins after the Second World War, maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, perhaps to a certain extent, and then maybe the end of the Cold War in the 1980s. So there might have been a bit of Europe in that. So we might think about Britain's role in the Cold War to a certain extent, but we mainly tend to understand it as involving the two big superpowers and the kind of the diplomatic and military relations between them.
Yeah, it's like Rocky IV, Hunt for Red October.
Exactly. Rocky IV is like the classic vision of what the Cold War is like.
Where he ends the whole Cold War. They're all chanting Rocky at the end. You have a different perspective. So in terms of seeing this as a global entity, talk us through what's been happening in the last decade or so with people's research. What is the global South and Afro-Asianism?
Yeah, so one of the things that historians have started to do over the last 10 years or so is to really try and think about the Cold War from a global perspective. So not just thinking about the US and the USSR, but thinking about the Cold War, how the Cold War affected countries all over the world in lots of different ways, and how the Cold War kind of manifests itself in lots of different kind of regions and different kind of conflicts. So you mentioned the kind of the global South. So the idea of the third world was something that came out of the Cold War period and was tied up with the process of decolonization, which happened at the same time. So while you've got this superpower conflict going on, the other kind of big thing happening in world history is you get this huge kind of kind of swathe of new post-colonial states emerging. And so that kind of process becomes entangled with the Cold War, and it means that the Cold War ends up influencing lots of other things happening in lots of different parts of the world, particularly in the third world, particularly in the global South, as we call it today. And if we think about things like Afro-Asianism, so one of the things that was going on during this time is that these newly independent states were seeking to find ways of cooperating and working together and kind of forging their own independent paths outside of the framework of the Cold War and outside of what they saw as the very kind of negative impact of the Cold War and the superpowers on their ability to thrive as independent post-colonial states.
So we're immediately moving away from how we understand the Cold War, aren't we? We're moving away from this Hollywood-worthy good versus evil nonsense that we've been force-fed for decades and moving towards something far more nuanced, but that involves far more people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, if you really take any country in the world, you can think of a way where the Cold War had an influence, whether that be kind of South Africa or New Zealand or Angola or Guatemala or anything like that. And quite often what you find is that influence was a really, really negative one. So what you see is Cold War dynamics driving a huge amount of violence and death and destruction and warfare, and quite often in kind of wars that we don't normally think of as traditional Cold War conflicts like Vietnam or Korea. But where there's this kind of this conflict between communism and capitalism and between the two superpowers is really having a destructive impact on people's lives around the world. So if we think about places like Indonesia or Malaysia or Angola or Guatemala, you can argue that a lot of the kind of the violence and the warfare and the conflict that happened in these countries during this period is indirectly or directly linked to the Cold War.
Why do you think we tend to gravitate towards the traditional view of, as we've said, the good versus evil, and why hasn't it been given the emphasis that it needs until now?
So I think it's partly because the way we understand, so that the writing of the history of the Cold War happened during the Cold War itself, or started during the Cold War itself. So people started writing about studying the Cold War in the US and in the UK during the Cold War. So the way that kind of that scholarship and those ideas developed was itself a kind of a product of the Cold War. And that history, to some extent, is quite an easy way for us to understand the period. We can have a kind of a nice, a narrative arc. We understand the beginning, we understand the end, we understand the kind of the key points within it. And if you try to think more globally about the Cold War and bring in all of these different countries and all of these different things, it becomes a lot more complicated, right? And so if you were like a teacher teaching kind of year 8 or year 9 about the Cold War, you've got the question of, how do you kind of cram all of this in a way that still makes sense? For kids, or if you're a TV producer or a film producer and you're doing something about the Cold War, how do you kind of tell this more nuanced story without kind of losing your audience? But I also think your point about good guys and bad guys is right, in that we, in the West, we think about the Cold War as ultimately a conflict between good and evil, where good won, where we won. And if we take a more kind of global perspective on these kind of things, what we see is not kind of good guys versus bad guys, but what we see is a kind of a conflict between kind of more or less equal blocks, which is kind of in which both blocks are acting equally destructively towards kind of countries and communities around the world. So I think from a British perspective, thinking about the kind of this more complicated history of the Cold War, for example, involves thinking about kind of the British War in Malaya after the Second World War, and the way that the kind of Britain's fear of communism and communist insurgency in Malaya drove kind of the violence of the counter-insurgency efforts there. And so that kind of story from a British perspective is obviously more complicated than the story of the kind of the good West against the bad communist East.
I think as well. It's sexier, isn't it, to tell a story where those two are pointing thermonuclear weapons at each other. So, but in terms of the weapons of mass destruction, so for most of this period, only a handful of nations actually have access to these. And I think that's the perspective we get, is those nations. But what about the people that don't? How do they view the tensions between the USA and the USSR? And what sort of influence do they attempt to exert to reduce those tensions?
So one of the things that some countries try to do is to try to get their own weapons, right? So you have this kind of process in the Cold War where you start off with just the US and the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons, but they're quickly joined by Britain, by France, by China. But then as the Cold War develops, you have the development of nuclear weapons in places like South Africa, in Israel, in Pakistan. So there's this kind of process of proliferation. Non-nuclear states, particularly in the kind of the third world and the global south, do attempt to try to kind of encourage the superpowers to limit nuclear weapons and to promote non-proliferation, particularly through organizations like the non-aligned movement. So the non-aligned movement was a kind of an alliance of mainly Asian, African, and Latin American states who were seeking to maintain their distance from the two superpowers. And one of the things that they tried to do was to kind of promote the anti-nuclear cause and to encourage the nuclear powers to limit their production of nuclear weapons. Whether they were influential or successful is another question. And I think one can argue that, I mean, obviously nuclear proliferation and nuclear tensions continued throughout the Cold War, where there were kind of periods of détente and where there were these kind of non-proliferation agreements between the superpowers, I think probably the kind of the pressure for them came domestically or came from the superpowers themselves. I don't think realistically these kind of this anti-nuclear activism or anti-nuclear diplomacy from the non-aligned states particularly had a major influence.
And you've just mentioned there briefly about non-alignment. How many countries are just desperate to avoid being drawn into the spheres of influence of the capitalists and the communists? And how do they try and achieve that? Because, as we say, black and white, we see good guys versus bad guys, but there's a whole load of countries, I imagine, who are just trying to do their own thing and not get involved.
Yeah, so I would say most countries around the world and most of particularly these post-colonial states that emerged in the 50s and the 60s are keen to distance themselves to some extent from the Cold War conflict and the superpowers. It's a complicated story because all of the different countries, even the ones that came together in things like the non-aligned movement, had very different views of the conflict and very different ideological backgrounds. So in the non-aligned movement, for example, you had kind of Tito's Yugoslavia, so a communist state, although one at odds with the Soviet Union. But then you also had kind of capitalist states as well. So these kind of countries were never particularly unified. And they also changed over time, right? So the kind of the politics and the leaderships of all these kind of countries in, say, the early 1960s was very different from the late 1970s. So some countries were desperate to avoid entanglement with the superpowers in the Cold War. So countries like India after independence and the leadership of Nehru is quite a good example. But other countries, while they were keen to avoid kind of entanglements, what they also saw in the Cold War competition was a kind of an opportunity whereby maybe they could play the two superpowers off against each other and try and get the kind of particularly the economic aid they felt they needed from both sides. So a really good example of that is Egypt under Nasser, where Nasser was kind of notorious at the time for managing to play the two superpowers off against each other and to get fairly major amounts of aid out of both the United States and then out of the Soviet Union. And so we should think of I think many of these kind of states saw the Cold War kind of context as an opportunity to some extent, as well as something that they wanted to avoid.
I'm just laughing because I think Anthony Eden might have had a more forceful description of Nasser his doings. So one of the things that has been mentioned in terms of the international perspective of the Cold War is domino theory. So for those listeners that don't understand this, what is domino theory, first of all?
So domino theory was mainly a US idea that kind of came to prominence in the 1950s, so under the Eisenhower administration, but kind of remained influential, I think, for the 1980s. And this was the idea that that communism was spreading around the world, and that if you let communism win in one country, then it would create this kind of domino effect where it would win in another country and another country and another country, and then before you know it, you'd have a kind of a communist takeover of the world. And so it was particularly influential when the US were looking at places like East and Southeast Asia, and they thought, look, if we let the communists win in Korea, if we let the communists win in Vietnam, maybe we don't necessarily care that much about those countries in and of themselves, but the reason it would be really bad would be because it would create this kind of chain reaction. So if we want to stop communism winning globally, if we want to defend the United States against communism, even though realistically there's no threat of kind of there's no realistic communist threat to the United States, then what we have to do is we have to go out and find communism wherever it's posing a threat, wherever around the world it looks like it might be victorious, and we have to fight it there. And so that's the kind of idea which explains why the US in particular, but also countries like Britain, end up fighting these wars against communism in such far-flung places which don't obviously have any kind of major strategic impact for those countries. So in places like Korea and in Vietnam and Laos and things like that. I think from a British perspective, I'm from Gloucester, and there's lots of big monuments in Gloucester about the Korean War, because a lot of the regiments British regiments who fought in Korea were from Gloucester. And when I look at it, I always think, why on earth in the 1950s were people from Gloucester fighting in Korea? What was the point of that? And the only reason was because of this fear of communism, the idea if we let communism win in Korea, then who knows what's going to happen, and who knows what would be next.
I think so. I just want to segue quickly, because that's what we do on history all of the time. So the more I find out about America in this sort of period of the middle 20th century after the Second World War, and how much agency America tries to exert over the rest of the planet in shaping other people's countries and stuff. Do you see the same on the Soviet side as well?
So I think probably the Soviet influence around the world was much less than the US. So the Soviet Union was obviously very influential in Eastern Europe, in the kind of the satellite states that were set up after the Second World War, and the Soviets did attempt to intervene in places like Korea and Afghanistan, and they supported lots of kind of conflicts in East and Southern Africa, for example. But the Soviet Union's kind of global base system was nowhere like as extensive as the United States was, and the Soviet Union never really tried to kind of launch major military operations outside of its kind of immediate neighborhood. So, the Soviet Union might have invaded Afghanistan, but Afghanistan borders the Soviet Union, right? Whereas the United States was getting involved in these major wars, on
like
the completely other side of the world,
isn't it? Like,
yeah,
you don't see the equivalent of the Soviet Union, like, I don't know, picking somewhere totally random in South America, going, all right, we need to go there and enforce communism to try and oppose America and capitalism.
No, and so the Soviet Union did support kind of leftist or kind of anti-colonial movements in different parts of the world, but never had the resources to do that to the same extent that the United States was able to do that. So I think if you're thinking about the US, one of the reasons why the US is so kind of globally influential is partly this idea of the domino theory, right? That they think the Soviet Union is more kind of globally ambitious and more globally capable than it really is, so that they feel that they have to they have to involve themselves in these kind of global conflicts, because if they don't, they'll let communism triumph. But that's really that's to some extent paranoia, right? That's a kind of a misunderstanding of the ability of the Soviet Union to kind of project its influence. And I think probably in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, this kind of the Soviet desire to spread communism around the world was a very real one. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was incredibly poor, where its economy had been destroyed, where it had kind of it had to focus all of its resources on rebuilding its own economy, there was no chance really that someone as kind of canny as Stalin was going to kind of launch any kind of romantic revolutionary kind of crusade to try and spread communism around the world. That's just not what the Soviet Union was interested in.
Yeah, so we did like an episode on the history of the CIA with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who wrote a book on that, and it terrifies me, the extent to which America is meddling in things that aren't directly connected to America. But as you say, so much of it is born out of paranoia.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing we could question is how much of it is paranoia, how much of it is a deliberate attempt to kind of spread US influence and kind of economic power and military power around the world. So this is kind of the end of the Second World War is this kind of period of American ascendancy and the kind of the spread of kind of global American hegemony around the world. So some historians would say there's an element of paranoia, but there's an element of calculation here as well. And US military interventions were always tied up with the kind of the spread of kind of US economic opportunities and things like that as well. But I think it certainly is something that needs to be explained, right? It's not something that kind of happened naturally, or was a kind of a natural response to kind of a genuine Soviet threat.
And just very quickly coming back to that domino theory, how central should domino theory be to our wider understanding of the Cold War? Do you think its significance is overplayed, or do you think it has a place in our understanding?
I think it's important. It's an important way for us to understand US kind of mentalities during the Cold War. So to understand why the US government acted as it did and how the US generally understood the world. I don't think it's important as a kind of an accurate description of what was going on at the time necessarily. So I don't think I don't think we can say that, if communism had triumphed in the Korean War, there was a genuine possibility that it would have become globally dominant across, Asia and sub-Saharan Africa and things like that. But it's certainly true that there were those within the US administrations who did think that, and so therefore it's an important way for us to understand American actions.
You've mentioned it already, but I want to talk to you about decolonization. So certainly colonial powers tended to blame communism or feared its influence in destabilizing their empires. How much of an influence does the Cold War have on the efforts of colonized nations to assert their independence?
So it has a really big impact. So a lot of this kind of colonial fear about this destabilizing kind of power of communism was true to a certain extent, in that a lot of major anti-colonial movements and leaders were influenced by communism. So if you think about Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, he was a kind of a Vietnamese nationalist to begin with, but he went to France in 1919 and became a member of the French Communist Party because this was just after the Bolshevik Revolution, and he saw kind of Lenin and Leninism as kind of the political movement that was most likely to support and to help to achieve Indonesian or Vietnamese independence. And a lot of other kind of anti-colonial leaders around the world were communists or were influenced by communism as well, but by no means all of them. And there were lots of kind of fairly vehemently anti-communist national liberation leaders as well. I think after many states gained independence, they, as we said before, they were keen to kind of maintain a kind of balance in their relations between the two superpowers. And even the kind of post-colonial states which had kind of avowedly socialist governments, so let's say places like Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, saw their brand of socialism as very different from the Soviet Union and tried to maintain a certain distance between them. But I think, going back to this question of kind of violence, I think what a lot of post-colonial states were trying to do was to kind of build to achieve rapid economic development and to build kind of stable and peaceful societies. And they saw the Cold War as a potentially really destabilizing force and something that could undermine their kind of post-colonial projects. And that's really where their desire to kind of avoid these kind of Cold War entanglements came from.
So what do you think the cultural impact of the Cold War is across the globe? So can the argument be made that it's partially responsible for globalization, or do we see the origins of that already apparent before it starts?
I think we see the origins of globalization apparent much earlier, and historians of globalization say it starts at different times, but you can go back to the kind of the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries or earlier if you want to. In some ways, the Cold War really hampered globalization, because obviously this idea of kind of the world split in two doesn't kind of chime very well with the kind of the idea of globalization as we understand it today. So a lot of the kind of this was a period of developing transport and communication technologies. So to some extent, it was a time when the kind of the world was coming closer together. But if we think about the way the global economy develops, for example, the economy centered around the West was not particularly integrated with the economy centered around the Soviet Union or around China. So we could probably say that if the Cold War hadn't happened in the way it had, then global interconnectedness and integration would potentially have happened much more smoothly and much more quickly. There were bits of the Cold War that kind of promoted certain forms of globalization. So, for example, you have got lots of students during the Cold War from the Middle East and from Africa going to study in, say, the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or even China as part of the efforts by these kind of socialist and communist states to kind of promote their influence around the world. So lots of historians recently have been focusing on what they call kind of second, third world connections. So the kind of the relationships and the connections between the socialist world and the communist states on one hand, and the kind of third world post-colonial states on the other. And that's a form of globalization. Right, it's just slightly different from the way we normally understand globalization. And even across the Cold War divide between East and Western Europe, where we normally think of the Iron Curtain as this kind of impassable barrier. It wasn't in reality, and there was lots of connections and kind of travel and entanglements across the Iron Curtain. But going back to my what I said before, I think probably the Cold War, we should see the Cold War as something that hampered global interconnectedness and global cooperation more than the other way around.
And finally, just to round things off, David, where do you think the study of this period needs to go next? What's still missing from our understanding, and what are some of the emerging ideas that have quite a good amount of potential to revolutionise what we appreciate of happening during the Cold War?
Yeah, so I mean, probably what I'd say there is that I think what we should do going forward is pay less attention to the Cold War. So the way we normally understand the 20th century, or again, the way it's kind of taught in schools, is you have like the First World War, the interwar period and the Great Depression and stuff like that, the Second World War, and then the Cold War. That's the 20th century as it's kind of taught. And the idea that the Cold War is the most important thing, or the defining thing of the kind of the second half of the 20th century, I think is really misleading, partly because it obscures this these other really important, arguably much more important processes of decolonization, of globalization, of kind of development and economic development, of relations between kind of the global north and the global south. And all of that gets lost if we just think about this as the Cold War period. And so what I would like to see in kind of 10 or 20 years time is actually the Cold War being taught much less in schools, it being kind of less popular amongst kind of the general public and university students and things like that, and people paying much more attention to all of these other things that are going on in the second half of the 20th century, like decolonization, like globalization, which are all kind of entangled with the Cold War, and which the Cold War kind of influences in lots of ways, but which are also their own things, which have their own history.
In the spirit of that, and because you've just blown people's minds with this, what should they read? Where should they start?
If they're interested in the Cold War, there's a recent book that's come out by a historian called Odd Arne Westad, who's a Norwegian historian, and he's one of the kind of the big historians of this kind of global turn in Cold War scholarship. It's called The Cold War: A World History. I think it was published by Penguin a couple of years ago, and that's kind of the best kind of overview of all of these new ideas and all of these new global perspectives on the Cold War. If people are interested in some of these other topics, it's difficult because I don't think there's a lot of kind of academic scholarship on decolonization, things like that, but I don't think that's necessarily fed through into kind of kind of popular history books to the same extent. So I can't think of a particular book to recommend that would offer that, but I think I don't know, I would encourage people to think about particularly this history of decolonization, and to kind of to look out for works on that, and to think about the history of kind of Nehru's India, and the history of kind of post-colonial kind of Egypt and Ghana and Angola and all of these kind of things, because I think those are the types of history that kind of give us an insight into these kind of processes.
That's it. That's your next project. You need to do a popular history about decolonization. David, thank you so much for coming on to give us an overview of a global Cold War, and not just the Rocky versus Ivan Drago Cold War that we've all grown up with. It's been brilliant.
Great. Thank you very much.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org. where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great